Welcome to the Regulation Podcast from the Institute of Regulation. My name is Marcel Bou, Chair of the Institute and a regulator myself. This podcast focuses on an issue that every regulator grapples with, and one that politicians and the public have a view on too, which is this: how do you know whether there is too much regulation or too little? And how do regulators get the balance right? To discuss this with us, we have a senior former regulator who has also thought about and published on public administration to much acclaim. Martin Stanley was a senior civil servant in the business department before becoming the director of what is now the Better Regulation Executive. He then became chief executive of the Postal Regulator, now part of Ofcom, and then chief executive of the Competition Commission, now part of the Competition and Markets Authority. So he has a wide experience of regulatory theory and practice on the economic and business side that complements my background regulating MPs' health, equality and financial services. But Martin may now be best known for his widely read publication, How to be a Civil Servant, now in its 5th edition. He has published a very handy introduction to regulation too. Martin, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Subject dear to my heart.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining us. Now, I introduced the topic of today's podcast as getting the balance right between too much and too little regulation. You'll accept, I'm sure, that assessing too much or too little of anything involves judgment as well as objectivity. And it involves politics. Governments of all colours bemoan too much regulation until the moment when something goes wrong, when they may introduce new rules and new regulators. This Labour government, for example, is keen that regulation promotes growth, and ministers have spoken in favour of deregulation. And at the same time, they're legislating for a football regulator, new building safety regulations, and the regulation of workers' rights. So before we get into the substance of the issues, Martin, what's your view overall on getting the balance right between too much and too little regulation?
First thing to say is it is extremely difficult. I mean, the list you've just gone through contains several examples of how hard it is to get the balance right, either politically or within any one regulator. I don't think there's any golden rules. One thing we might come back to is maybe don't try and shift the balance too much, because people do get used to the current state of affairs, and there's a cost in moving away from where you are now.
Okay, so that's interesting right from the off. So one of the factors that we will need to be thinking about now is not only in the abstract, as it were, is there too much or too little, but where are you starting from? What's the current state of play? Because that will matter to those being regulated.
Exactly.
Good. Okay, so I mentioned in the introduction something about your regulatory background, and one of your key contributions to regulation was opening the postal market to competition and regulation. So can you just start off by telling us briefly how you did that and what lessons there might be for the topic of our discussion today?
Yeah. Well, it's quite a long time ago now, but back in the day, there was no competition for your mail. The Royal Mail was state-owned, a monopoly, and everything it did was controlled by ministers. But it was facing obviously going to face a lot of competition from the internet, which is developing very rapidly, email and that sort of thing. And it was very clearly an inefficient organisation, not providing a very good service. So to cut a long story short, we decided that the best thing for it was to actually make it compete with private sector operators. We didn't think private sector would get a huge share of the market, and when we look today, they haven't. But it would sharpen up Royal Mail's performance. Now, that caused a huge fuss. It's got a very strong union, very nervous politicians. But I think looking back on it, we stuck to our guns. We did really effective consultation. We talked to everybody we could. We explained what we were doing all the time, and we got through to the other end. So an interesting example, if you like, of a regulator being both sensible and brave and not backing down. The other thing I remember very clearly from that was we were absolutely determined that the public should retain faith in the postal services. We couldn't have companies coming in and losing mail and generally providing a service quality which was abysmal. And we couldn't have unlicensed operators, because as soon as you start licensing competitors, you find other companies saying, "Oh, we'll move in and we won't bother actually getting proper licenses and doing the thing properly." And the first company that we saw operating without a license, we moved very quickly, prosecuted them, prosecuted the director, prosecuted the wife. It was it was very obvious to the industry what we were doing because we made it obvious. And my goodness, that stopped any further problem in that area. And the other thing we did was we threatened to prosecute a load of kids because the new operators were very tempted to get students to deliver their mail for them. Of course, students, when they got bored or ran out of time, would just dump the mail in the local skip, much to the annoyance of the people that saw them doing it. And again, we actually obviously didn't take them to court. We understood, but we made a great point of threatening the companies. And again, that problem died as quickly as we saw it. So I offer those two things as fair but strong regulation.
Excellent. Well, that's a really interesting example of starting regulation from scratch and setting the tone. That's what I'm hearing.
Absolutely.
Setting the tone for the market and those people who want to work to play in the market, as it were, so that they know that they've got to play by the rules.
Exactly.
Very interesting. Good. Okay. Well, that's helpful context for the topic on getting the balance right between too much and too little. So let's focus first on the too much side of the equation. And when people talk about too much regulation, they cite examples of constraints on business, allegations of bureaucracy and red tape, maybe laws that were passed decades ago and haven't been updated. So how would you define too much regulation?
I think, again, it's very hard to define it in the abstract. When ministers, politicians are thinking about regulating, I think one thing I would say to them is consider whether society itself or the market will not actually provide a better outcome than setting up a new office and a load of civil servants and so on to organise it. Antisocial behaviour, yes, it's very tempting to have regulations and new laws and new crimes, but society might actually sort it out for itself. One interesting example at the moment might be all the e-bikes that are lying around London streets and many other city streets, driving along pavements and so on. They're a real problem. I will be interested to see whether actually societal pressure gets people to be better behaved over a year or two. That would be so much better than actually having a regulator and lots of new laws and so on, and then people enforcing them and getting very fussed when they're not enforced and so on. So that's one example I would offer. More generally, you have to consider when you're introducing regulation the cost of regulation, the burden of regulation. It's always tempting to do a bit more because it seems at one level to be, you get a benefit from it. Better, more people caught, more people informed, more people educated, and so on. But every bit of bureaucracy adds a cost to the private sector, to charities, to small firms, and they struggle. And actually, you're doing damage. So getting that balance right is terribly difficult. And in general, as you can tell from my tone, I caution against it. Of course, lots of regulation is necessary, but best think twice or thrice before going down that road.
So, cautious about introducing new rules because, as we know, once you've introduced a rule, then it generates a whole load of bureaucracy and time and people and cost, and also it's quite hard to undo in due course. So that's a good lesson. So you're saying basically, let's see whether society, the market, can regulate itself to a degree.
Absolutely.
Before you move in.
Yeah.
And the example of e-bikes is an interesting one, because having somebody on the street corners, as it were, stopping people from cycling on pavements,
yes.
It would be quite a big deal.
Very intrusive. Absolutely. Yeah. And in other areas too, we do have a lot of regulation these days that are protecting children's health and safety, our own health and safety. to somebody of my generation, they appear quite intrusive and over the top, treating everybody like snowflakes, as we read in the papers. And yet you look at the statistics and so many fewer kids go into hospital. Road deaths way down compared with when I was a kid or a young adult. I can't possibly say where the balance should be in any one area. But I think you need the people setting regulatory policies within regulators themselves and outside, just thinking very carefully about these things and being very aware of the wider reaction of society.
Okay, so that's a really good cautionary message. There are tools that are in existence like these regulatory impact assessments that have been designed to encourage policymakers to think about the cost of regulation before they're implemented. Do you think they're good tools?
I think they are. I was way back chief executive of the Better Regulation Executive, and impact assessments were our thing. We didn't invent them, but we inherited them, improved them. There is a real danger that you can have too many bells and whistles and decorations on them and lose track of the fundamental issue in any regulation, which is the sort of issue we've just discussed. But if they're carefully drafted, carefully designed, absolutely vital. The real question is, will ministers listen to them?
Well, when there's a call for something to be done, then sometimes something just needs to be done, regardless of the potential costs.
Absolutely. One little hobby horse of mine is that the one organisation that, as far as I'm aware, is pretty much exempt from carrying out regulatory impact assessments is the Treasury and taxation and all the things they're responsible for. And some of the really silliest regulations in recent years and taxes in recent years have come out of the Treasury. And oh my goodness, they could have done with some regulatory impact assessments.
Well, that's interesting. So would you want a regulatory supervisor for the Treasury to require them to do that?
Well, every other department is required to do it. There is as we've seen with inheritance tax for farmers. That really would have been better if it had been consulted on to some extent. There probably, how do I know, but from what I read, there were probably better ways of achieving the same objective instead of just announcing it as a fait accompli. Well, that's a hobby horse of mine.
Well, interesting point. I'll be interested in others' views on this, listening to this. Okay, so we've had a think about the too much regulation side of the equation. What about the too little side? Places where there might be arguably too little regulation or maybe too little regulatory enforcement. I don't know what you think and other examples you might want to draw to our attention.
Yeah. The obvious examples of poor enforcement, Grenfell Tower, sewage discharges maybe from controlled by Ofwat or maybe not controlled by Ofwat. Harold Shipman wasn't caught quickly enough by the medical regulator. So there's all those. There is a sense, I think, that regulators can be nervous about moving in quickly where there is a problem. Nervous they're sort of going to upset somebody by rolling up their sleeves and getting involved in something that might be going wrong. And then, of course, there's areas like one of the really biggest regulatory disaster in recent decades must have been the 2008 financial crisis, which was surely due to overlight regulation, very much encouraged by ministers, but actually accepted by the financial services regulators. It's cost trillions and was a huge mistake. So yeah, if and when you decide regulation is necessary, as it so often is, and as those examples show it is, you're not going to stop regulating doctors. You're not going to stop regulating the financial service industry. Do it with spirit, do it with energy, and do it with with a willingness to upset people.
Yeah, which comes back to your postal example earlier on. Already we've seen here that this is far from straightforward. There are areas where regulation, in the example of e-bikes, might be excessive, and other cases where something bad has happened, financial crash, a doctor who's guilty of malpractice, etc., Grenfell, obviously, where, it's possible after the event to say, well, where was the regulator? They should have been moving faster, firmer, harder.
Yeah.
And this is all, therefore, about judgment. And it feels a little bit that there's a kind of constantly moving regulatory landscapes with economic and social and technological changes taking place in the community, and the rules and the regulators are always trying to catch up. Either they're a little bit slow and they need to be moving faster, or they're moving in a way that was appropriate a few years ago, but society has changed and they need to back off.
Yes.
So how do regulators get, not just regulators, but policymakers too, how do they get that balance right? What do they do?
Extremely difficult. I think listen and respond to criticism would be one thing. If you, there have been big problems, haven't there, in sort of the gas and electricity energy markets with companies going bust. Now, that problem was highlighted by private eye frequently, regularly, and for a long period before Ofcom did anything about it. So, I think they could have maybe, I don't know, I wasn't there, but from the outside, it doesn't half look as if they actually should have thought, maybe there is something in that criticism. Maybe we should do something. Another example which comes to mind is Ofsted and teachers and schools. Again, teachers, a majority, I think, of teachers were very unhappy with Ofsted. They didn't like being inspected. They felt the inspections were carried out in the wrong way. The way their schools were divided into one word segments didn't feel right. Now, I just got the impression, and I may be wrong, but within Ofsted there was just a feeling of they would say that, wouldn't they? And yet, a lot of very intelligent commentators were saying, actually, you can trust teachers a bit more. You can enter into discussions with teachers at the schools. It's too much of an outside body coming in, doing a quick inspection and walking out again. Now, all these things, I didn't work in Ofsted, I didn't work in Ofgem, I may be wrong, but from outside they did look to me as if the regulators were maybe too defensive. Yeah.
So I imagine that those people listening from organisations like Ofgem and Ofsted will, there'll be a natural reaction for all of us when, facing that kind of criticism to be a bit defensive and say, well, but this has worked. And they, as you say, they would say, well, that wouldn't they? Or that we're just working to the legislation that was passed in 1986 or whenever it happened to be, or this is what ministers want, and to find all kinds. So how can the system become more responsive? Because that's the key here. There are lots and lots of well-meaning, thoughtful people who are working in regulators and in policy departments who want regulation to work, want it to be agile.
Absolutely.
What kind of things can we do collectively as a system to make sure that old regulations get removed, that we are responsive to criticism in an appropriate way, etc., etc.?
I think it's a very difficult question, first of all. I would sort of respond in two ways. First of all, seriously review every so often what's happening. Boards, together with their senior executives, can sit down, maybe once a year and say, well, have we got the balance right? I don't think we ever did it. Postcom, to be honest. CMA, where I worked, was a different sort of organisation. We were given cases and just told to get on with them. But again, going back to that postal example, we were brought up short, quite shocked, when we went to a select committee hearing. Very nervous about the fact we were introducing competition. MPs, lots of letters, pressure from the unions and so on. And we were very proud of the fact we were keeping prices down and the competition was going to be good and all that. And then suddenly the committee turned to the fact that, well, you say, the Royal Mail should deliver, I can't remember the figure, 92.5% of first-class mail next day. What's the actual figure? I think it was 85%. And they said, shouldn't you be worried about that? Oh, my goodness, it brought us up short because actually we were so focused on price and we'd missed this other, I mean, I'm exaggerating a bit for effect, but to a certain extent, we were less interested in what was terribly important to the person sending a letter. Is it going to arrive on time? So I think that, so I'm bringing together two things. Review, maybe with outside help, get somebody from outside saying, hey guys, here's a list of things. Are you satisfied you're independent enough? Have you got the balance right? Do you enforce quickly enough or too quickly? Do you have the right relations with your regulated bodies and the people who work in them? Too soft, too hard? Just review it every so often. But also consult. Be aware that criticism from outside may actually be appropriate. There may be a message hidden there. Maybe not the message that's being broadcast by the media or the lobby groups, but there might be a message hidden there which you ought to take notice of.
Very interesting. And one of the things that I've found through working with the Institute of Regulation and regulators in the UK is that this kind of cross-sector forum can help regulators to see new ways of doing things.
Absolutely.
And that there are techniques for dealing with fitness to practice or price competition that other regulators have come up with, which is great to have a forum to talk about. And I know that the Professional Standards Authority for Health and Social Care, for example, encourages the regulators that it oversees to be agile. And they've got a methodology for making that happen through its so-called right touch regulation approach, which we've heard about in this podcast before. So there are models out there that people can have a look at. But having that independent voice, maybe bringing somebody in to just review your own regulatory approach from time to time, I think is a good thing to do. And maybe also just to be a bit humble. And to recognise that things change over time and that your regulatory approach, which might have been fit for purpose 10 years ago, is no longer fit for purpose.
Absolutely.
And then this brings me on to this, the massive technological changes that are taking place now, and these kind of supranational national organisations like Meta and X and social media platforms, all the rest of it, who sometimes feel beyond regulatory scrutiny. How do we keep up to date with that kind of development?
Again, it must be really challenging to work in Ofcom, for instance, at the moment, with Musk and Zuckerberg and so on, backed up by Mr. Trump. My goodness, they're going to have some interesting conversations over the next few months. I guess, as you can tell from what I've said already, I would say to them, if you're sure you're right, if you're sure you are doing what is necessary to defend children, to stop the harm that you were set up to harm, to stop, be brave. Stick up for yourselves. Be clear to ministers that you're doing so. If ministers want to change the law or send you a very clear message, let them do so. That's for politicians to decide. But you've got your legislation. You've got your marching orders, politely listening, explaining, but stick to your guns.
Great. Okay. So, no easy answers.
Absolutely
I think is the summary of the debate. And there are risks both of too much and too little regulation. Society evolves, the economy evolves, technology evolves, and regulators need to stay up to date, need to stay agile, but doing that within a legislative framework, within ministerial direction, it's all tricky stuff, isn't it?
It is.
So in terms of hints and tips that we want to leave people with, we've said maybe bring in an independent pair of eyes.
Yep.
And make sure that you're listening to feedback, even if it's uncomfortable. Absolutely. And your reaction is to be defensive.
Especially if it's uncomfortable.
Exactly. Look to good practice elsewhere. Obviously, the Institute of Regulation is one. I'll come on to your own websites in a moment. What other tips would you give people when they're thinking about how do I make sure my regulatory framework is appropriate for today?
I at the risk of repeating what I've said already, just get out of the office, meet other people, travel internationally, I would say, even though, it might cost a bit. Regulators elsewhere in Europe and in the States and elsewhere in the world, they're grappling with absolutely the same problems as you. And they've probably, got some ideas which might not have occurred to you about how to cope with these things. But actually, I can't really offer much more than talk to people, network, consult. Be prepared to accept that where you're at the moment isn't where you want to be next year or the year after, and be prepared to change it. There's nothing wrong with accepting that your present model isn't quite right because the world has changed.
Yeah, very, very wise. And the reference to international partners, I think, is a really good one because pretty much everything that we regulate in the UK is regulated somewhere else as well. In fact, pretty much everywhere else.
Yeah.
There's a great marine regulator in New Zealand, for example, and so on in other countries. The Netherlands, Australia, I know, are leading the way in many areas of regulatory practice. So that's great. That's a great advert too. So. Are there any final words on this difficult balance that regulators need to strike between too much or too little regulation?
Only to wish people luck. I think the regulatory world is enormously more difficult now than it was, frankly, when I was regulating. But I think the basic approaches that have worked over many years, back since regulations of the modern sort reared its ugly head in the 1980s. Regulators have continued to learn from experience, from those that have went before, but also from what's happening around them now. As long as they continue to do that, they'll be fine. Good luck. But do use mechanisms such as the Institute of Regulation, great ways of just getting out of your bubble.
Fantastic. Well, that reference to regulation raising its ugly head, I hope that all of those listening will have some kind of sympathy with the challenges that you grappled with when you were working in the regulators and indeed today. So thank you very much, Martin. It's been a great and important topic to talk about with lots to learn. And if you want to find out more, those of you listening to Martin Stanley's thinking, including on regulation, you can follow his Substack, UK Civil Servant, or check out his website, one of which is at www.regulation.org.uk, which is a very good IP address to have. Thanks also to our sound engineer, Neil Bowerman of Bowerman Audio Productions, and I hope that you found this discussion interesting. If you have, do let your colleagues know about it and tune in to future episodes where we will discuss other issues of interest to regulators, and you can find other material and events relevant to regulation at the Institute of Regulation's website, ioregulation.org. Thanks finally for listening to me, Martial Bou, at the Regulation Podcast. Good luck with your own regulatory challenges, and do stay in touch with each other and with the Institute to help UK regulation become the best it can. Goodbye.